Hikers of Reddit, what's the scariest thing you've seen in the wilderness? On a trail in the Australian bush. Beautiful day surrounded by nature. As sundown approaches, the shadows get really long and the temperature takes a massive dive. Desert climate. Suddenly, and I mean like in an instant, all of the sounds of birds, insects, even the wind dry up. I cannot hear a thing. At the same time, I get this primal fear creeping up my spine. I just know something is behind me on the trail. Looking back, there is nothing at all visible, but this feeling will not go and is so rooted in my amygdala that I start running. About 5 minutes of running down the trail and all of the bird song and insect noises come back, and it's like I imagined everything. I've been back to the same trail a number of times at the same time of day and never experienced anything quite like it, and it doesn't bother me to go back, but when I think of that specific day, it still sends shivers down my spine. A buddy of mine and I had a gold claim deep in the mountains in California. One day we were hiking up the river with our dogs to check out the river and see if anything changed over winter, as it sometimes does. He was an older man and saw a log and sat down for a smoke. I sat next to him and we were facing the river with a steep mountainside behind us with a ridge about 15+ feet up. Suddenly his smaller dogs started whining and ran up and hid under his legs, and my German shepherd stood up and did a low growl while looking up the hill. I joked, "That's not a good sign." I turned around and a very large mountain lion was crouched ready to pounce. We stood up and I started yelling as I grabbed my pistol. The lion realized we weren't small easy prey and took off running. We knew there were bears and mountain lions around but never saw one before. If the dogs hadn't noticed and reacted, it likely would have pounced us and tore us up before we could fight it off. We were both armed, so one of us would have gotten off a shot. I never went anywhere there ever again without at least one gun. We were 15 miles from the nearest paved road and another 30 miles to any civilization, so being injured up there would suck. I was living in Mexico at the time, in a tent, in the jungle. We were doing work to help build a hiking trail that would connect two towns, which were about 5 miles apart. I would sleep on the outskirts of one town. I wake up, hike a few miles until hitting the end of the trail, then spend the day hacking dense vines with a machete, shoveling big rocks out of the way, and raking out the trail. It was thick Mexican jungle, hot, lots of bugs, and lots of crazy noises. Well, one day it was just me and one friend working the trails. I was in front, raking the dirt, and had my back turned to the twisted mess of brush and trees behind me. I'm raking, and suddenly I hear the movement of something large in the bushes behind me. I turn around and see a smooth, sleek, massive cat climb down from this tree within 20 feet of where I stood. It was slow and elegant. I saw its whole body stretch out, with its front two paws on the ground and its backside stretching up to the branch it had previously been watching me from. It was pure black. Beautiful creature, really, but petrified me, armed with nothing more than a plastic rake. I held it up and slowly started taking a few steps back, but it didn't seem to have any interest in me. It didn't even look at me. It just retreated into the bushes and became invisible within a matter of seconds. So my friend and I are obviously very shaken up and don't want to continue the day's work. We hike back to town, find a restaurant, and we sit down and order a beer. The bartender sees two gringos in dirty clothes holding machetes and getting a beer at 10 AM. So obviously he asks us what was up. We told him our story, and he tells us that a good friend of his is actually a big cat researcher in the area who tags them and wanted us to meet him so we could show him a map of where we saw the cat. Researcher dude meets us at the bar and we tell the story again. He asks us to describe the cat, and we do. He shows us a few photos of big cats so we can verify that we saw what we say we saw. First photo is an ocelot, stripes and relatively small. Nope. Cat we saw was huge. Next photo was a jaguar. Yeah, that's the right size, but the one we saw was perfectly black, no pattern, no gold color. Scientist dude looks at us like, "Are you messing with me?" Well, we weren't messing with him. He sits back in his chair and strokes his beard, then says, "Well, there have been rumors, and I don't know if they are true, but apparently there have been a few sightings of a big black cat, like you've described. Now, black jaguars are not native to this area, so it's not likely, but the rumor is that some cartel guys brought a black panther from Africa. Something happened and they had to release it, so they let it go in the jungle. That may be what you had seen, and that is the time that I encountered an African black panther with an apparent coke habit deep in the jungles of Mexico. I was hiking with my father last summer on the Colorado Trail. We heard noises and saw large tracks we assumed were moose. Naturally we were on high alert, since moose are terrifying. We swore through the clearing there was a moose making noises, and when we were taking a look at it, we noticed it was not a moose, but a cow, and we later saw a whole herd of cows. That was weird, just walking in the forest and seeing a ton of cows lol. My siblings and I were wandering around the forest behind our neighborhood and we came across an old refrigerator in the middle of nowhere. It had metal chains wrapped around it and a big padlock keeping it shut. We were pretty spooked by it, so we went home and told our dad about it. He came back with us to take a look for himself, and he agreed how creepy it was. The next day he notifies the police and he takes them to it, but when they return Dad says that the fridge was gone. They could clearly make out tracks dragging it back to the road using a hand truck, and the cops suspected that it could have been something to do with the gangs and drug trafficking in the area. We were honestly really glad that we never got to see inside of that fridge. But what really creeped us out was that there was a high chance that whoever moved the fridge saw us nosing about it and then got rid of it. When we left, we quickly decided it would be for the best if we stopped exploring our local gang and drug infested forest. Coming down a mountain trail at dusk, I realize I may have lingered at the summit a bit too long. By my estimation I have perhaps a bit less than an hour to the trailhead. I'm alone, but know the trail well, and have a headlamp on me. Just as dusk fades into a moonless, pitch black night, I'm rounding a corner and freeze instinctively. A shine is reflecting back at me from the darkness. About 30 yards away, the vague outline of a large solitary black bear emerges from the forest and steps onto the trail. Facing me, it stares at me, and I stare back. Black bears live in this area. I've known this, and seen them twice before during the day on previous trips. Nothing like being face to face with one at night though. I raise my hands above my head, making myself as big as possible. I scream long and loud, as guttural and fierce a man's scream I can muster. The bear pauses and chuffs at me, briefly looking behind it at the forest it came from. It then slowly and casually turns away from me, walking back into the forest from where it came. The crunching sound of leaves underfoot of the bear grows quieter until the only thing I can hear is my pounding heartbeat. I realize I now have to go in the same direction as the bear went. Maybe a minute or so goes by, and I sprint. As I pass the point where the bear stood, I glance at the woods while not stopping, and see nothing. Shortly after, while running, I look back behind me, back up the trail, to make sure I'm not followed. I continue to periodically glance behind me while running down the mountain. I endure maybe 30 long minutes of running in pitch darkness down this mountain with my heart at 130 beats per minute. Thankfully I didn't trip or fall and injure myself. Made it back to the trailhead safely. My wife and I were hiking on one of our usual routes when we heard a noise I'd never heard before. In the moment, it sounded like a parrot to me. I legit asked if there was a parrot in the trees. The noise keeps happening and eventually we see a younger deer emerge next to the trail. Turns out deer make an alarm sound when they get spooked. This little dude followed us for a good 5 minutes making this noise. We also camped at this park one time and heard assumed blood-curdling screams at about 3 AM. It was likely coyotes, but at 3 AM and in the dark your mind goes to some scary places. I have dogs that are a tad impolite, so I try to find rarely used trails or just make my own trails. One day I way deep out in the woods just wandering, and my dogs started acting very strangely. They were sniffing the air and looking around in every direction. I stopped beneath a big tree and waited for a little bit, but I couldn't hear or see anything for some reason. I glanced up in the tree and my stomach dropped into my shoes. There was some dirty looking guy with a gun just sitting there up in the tree. I tried my best to stay composed and mustered up a smile and said, "Hey, how's it going?" The dude just stared at me and didn't say anything. I casually turned around and walked back the way I came without looking back at him. In all likelihood it was probably just a poacher who wasn't thrilled that I had seen him hunting out of season, but it was unsettling nonetheless. I'm from a rural southern US area, and I got lost in the woods in the middle of July before the age of cell phones. I tried navigating a creek that I thought would get me back, while seeing snakes visibly entering the water from the creek bank, and at one point the banks became too high to climb back up without going back, and the water became pretty deep, almost chest level. I finally came out to a clear spot and a trail that led to a camper. As I was looking at it, a middle-aged man burst out of the camper yelling and pointing a shotgun at me, asking if I was law enforcement. I was a 19-year-old kid, soaking wet and bleeding in 1,000 places from briars where I just started running because I'd been lost for hours before I even found the creek. But anyway, I forgot about all that when he pointed that shotgun at me. I convinced him I wasn't ATF or whatever, and he walked me to a dirt road that connected to the main road. Turns out he had whiskey stills and he thought I was there because of that. Or maybe he was making meth. IDK. But I fully believe he intended to kill me for a good minute or so. In Scotland there are these free-to-use shelters in the mountains and glens called bothers. They're usually old farmsteads that had been left abandoned during the Highland clearances, or simply by people moving to the cities in the 1800s and early 1900s. They're very basic. Wooden benches to sleep on, maybe a toilet if you're lucky, and usually an open fire if you carry in your fuel. As you can imagine, they're pretty creepy places. I was staying in one called Invermelly Bothy near Fort William. We were sleeping upstairs when we were all woken up at about 2 AM with the front door downstairs opening loudly, clear footsteps coming in, and walking on the old hardwood floor and the chairs being moved. Me and the two guys I was with were all woken by this. We even heard someone cough a few times. I shouted out, "Hello, are you okay?" thinking maybe someone was hurt as it was 2 AM and cold outside, and we were, but there was no response. Instead it was just quiet. We all went downstairs and nobody was there. The chairs had moved from where they were originally. Our wet jackets were hanging over them to dry by the fire. Didn't hear anyone leave. The door was closed. Couldn't see any head torches outside in the dark. We were really scared. Now none of believe in ghosts, but all three of us heard it and were woken by it. We heard the door, the footsteps, the chairs moving, and the coughing. Tried to tell ourselves that maybe it was a deer had got in and then left, but the door was shut back over properly. No idea, but the building was built in 1776. The family that lived there probably had a hard life and they were forcibly evicted during the Highland clearances, and the rest of the settlements around this surviving building were burnt down. So it's not had a great history. Still gives me the creeps. I wasn't hiking, but I spend a lot of time in the woods, and I've seen and experienced plenty of weird things. Once, I found a chicken that had been burnt and decapitated in an area where I would go almost every day at one point. I still don't know who killed it, or why they left it right on the trail in the local woods. Other than that, a few times a friend and I have seen what we believe to be Sasquatch. I know it sounds crazy, and I still don't fully believe it myself, but it's honestly the best explanation. If it's not some kind of Bigfoot creature, or multiple for that matter, then it'd have to be a homeless person running around in the woods of Rhode Island, wearing a gorilla suit, walking through knee-deep water in the middle of February for no good reason. I only got a good look at it once, and it looked to be maybe 6 to 7 feet tall, covered in brown hair or fur. I know it wasn't a bear, because I didn't see a snout and its arms swung when it walked, which bears don't do when they walk on their hind legs. It walked almost identically to the creature in the Patterson Jim Lynn footage, except that it didn't look back at me. I don't think it knew I was there at all. That was the first time I saw it, and I've never seen it so clearly ever since. And it's been 4 or 5 years at this point. I've undoubtedly gone through those woods hundreds of times since then, if not more than 1,000. And in that time I've only caught brief glimpses. I've had rocks thrown at me a couple of times, but I still go back. I've gone both solo and with a friend. Between the two of us, we've still only seen signs of Sasquatch a handful of times in the years since. Based on what we've seen, I think there was at least 2 different creatures in those woods, but I haven't seen any real sign of them in a while. I know it sounds crazy. Believe me, if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. Not something I saw, but something that I was close to, and didn't know it until a year later. I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2014. and was very near to the body of Geraldine Lagay, aka Inchworm, who had gone missing in Maine the previous year. While also through hiking, the area that she was last seen was a shelter deep in the woods of central Maine, easily the most remote part of the AT. This is within about 10 days hike from the northern terminus of the trail. Details of her disappearance can be found simply by googling her name, so I won't go into them here, but in essence, she was hiking alone, needed to pee, and wandered off the trail just a couple hundred of feet, and couldn't find her way back. She tried to find high ground to send some texts, then made camp, where she spent nearly a month, keeping a journal as best she could. She eventually died of exposure, having become increasingly disoriented and deprived of food. There was a massive search for her body the rest of that summer into the fall, but it was called off when winter set in. It was assumed that she fell while trying to ford a rain-swollen river. There's a number you have to ford in Maine, and had been swept downstream. In reality, her body was wrapped in her sleeping bag and lying less than 2 miles from the Ed corridor. Her body was found in 2015 in that condition by a forester. She had simply gotten confused and not been able to find her way in the woods. We all knew that a hiker had gone missing in that area the year before my through hike, but we all assumed that the official explanation was the most likely. The shelter where she was last seen had become a makeshift memorial to her by then. None of us ever imagined that she was so close by. It gave me goosebumps when they found her. Went for a wander in BC, Canada. Lost the trail, and let me tell you, it gets dark. Like dark, literally can't see your hand in front of your face. Dark in the forests. When the sun goes down, I'm alone. No source of light on me. Dead silent. And literally feeling my way along the ground, and from tree to tree trying to find a road or train tracks or something. Then suddenly I hear the most terrifying blood-curdling lady scream I've ever heard, and felt myself go numb. It was loud and close. Straight up thought someone was being murdered. Things are a fuss from that point to when I finally stumbled onto a road, but I know I was running as fast as I could. Fully repressed the entire thing until years later I was watching a video about wild animals, and they showed footage cougar screaming at night. Holy crap, as soon as I heard it, I went numb and started shaking. Then memory came rushing back of that night I thought I heard a woman get killed in the forest. Once I settled down, it occurred to me that I'm only alive right now because that cougar let me live. I'm not a small guy, 6 feet 1, 215 pounds. Athletic, and I don't really get scared, but I was absolutely terrified, and anyone that thinks they can square up with a cougar is a moron beyond help. Even though they're not super big, they will end your lineage and you won't even hear it. Hike with friends, stick to trails, be aware of remaining daylight in your current location, bring a flashlight, bring a whistle, and drink water.